Hello there and welcome back to another video. In this one we're going to be doing another look at things I love about a particular Battletome. In this case we're going to be looking at the new Battletome for the Flesh Eater Courts that has come out recently for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now, I was one of those people who was a little bit sort of like, really? Okay, this is how this works? For the Flesh Eater Courts when they initially were released. Very much an interesting faction that I think has grown and developed over the last little while and certainly become more of a thing over the course of the various editions of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. For those people who don't know, it's the majority of it is made up of a lot of the stuff that came from the ghoulish side of the old Vampire Counts armies from back in the day. But in this case, we're seeing them sort of updated and tweaked with a really interesting backstory to them. And you can see that kind of represented here in the artwork for that fellow, and then what you see there as well. Bum, bum, bum. So the thing that sort of drives the Flesh Eater Courts is actually a sort of a sense of madness, and that spills out of this fellow, who is the Carrion King, Ushoran, who is a brand new miniature that came out not that long ago, actually, for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, towards the end of last edition. So, the Flesh Eater Courts, as their name would suggest, are very much one of those factions that think they are something else. Whilst to everybody else they look like absolutely bloodthirsty, cannibalistic, murderous, gore-soaked warriors with massive claws and all that kind of thing, they see themselves in their delusions as grand and noble knights, lords and ladies who are at feast and everything else that comes with it. And this is one of the things, again, that stems from the Carrion King himself and Ushoran that I really, really like about the Flesh Eater Courts and where they've taken them. Games Workshop could easily have just said they were another sort of faction of death or whatever, but I think adding in the delusion just gives them a tragic nature, which you don't necessarily see with a lot of other factions, apart from the likes of maybe the Stormcast Eternals and maybe the Idoneth Deepkin as well. But I really like that that's been sort of like nailed home with the Flesh Eater Courts. I actually read a Gotrek and Felix book, not Gotrek and Felix, but Gotrek book not long ago, where Ghoulslayer, where he actually comes up against a bunch of these fellows, and from their viewpoint, they just see themselves as these noble warriors, and it's only when you flip around to Gotrek's viewpoint and his perspective that you see them for what they really are. And I think this is told in even more detail when you look at the background of the Carrion King himself. So he was one of the great Mortarchs of Nagash. I mean, to an extent he still is. He's the Mortarch of Delusion, and Ushoran was this sort of noble vampire warrior. He would do anything he could to try and make sure that his peoples were looked after. Admittedly, he's still a vampire, so that obviously fed into things there, of course, as well. Fed. But in essence, he was trying to do like right by his people. He was well loved. He was a great Shaishan noble. He had lots of lands and that kind of thing. He was seen by all sorts of different names, like I think it's the Summer King and all that kind of stuff as well. The Somber Paladin. But Nagash, being Nagash, wasn't quite happy with that, and so decided to play a little bit of a trick on him. And so here we see like Ushoran was defeated, and there was a rift between Ushoran and Nagash. He was sealed away in the Shroud Cage, and there he turned into almost the beast that you see before you there too. What's really interesting is that it feels like Ushoran has a sense of what has happened to him, but also not at the same time. So even though he is deluded and sort of driven by the same badness as the rest of the Flesh Eater Courts, he also seems to tend to kind of like retain a lot of his kind of vampiric noble manner as he's gone through. This has then fed into all sorts of different things that have happened in Age of Sigmar over the end of 3rd edition and the beginning of 4th, where his blood was used to spread blight and delusion within the likes of Hammerhal Akshi and that kind of thing as well. And so through all of that, he's had a really massive impact on the way that things have happened. You also get to see a lot of that in the characters and the delusions that we see here. So this is something that I think is really nice, and it's something that's popped up also in the Nighthawk book, which we'll also be having a look at for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And here's where they've sort of delved into all of the different sort of ideas behind the different characters. You have characters like Ho Falconer Felgrin, who's one of the new miniatures that was added into the book with this edition, who sees himself as a sort of animal wrangler and huntsman or something within the court of the Flesh Eaters, but in actual fact he just is surrounded by horrible bats and wolves and all that kind of thing. And it's always fascinating seeing how all of this sort of comes together to create the faction that we see before us as part of the Flesh Eater courts. Now, like any good ghoul or zombie, the Flesh Eater courts tend to find themselves amidst all sorts of different elements of society. And in some ways, what's quite interesting is that they are most certainly a death faction, and they are most certainly cannibals and horrible and nasty and bitter and twisted. But you could also see them fighting alongside the forces of order, because they might look at something like the Stormcast Eternals or the Cities of Sigmar and see, oh, poor peasants that need to be defended. And so they'd ride into battle, or charge into battle to defend these poor peasants or these noble warriors who are sacrificing themselves. And it's then only after that that they sort of gorge themselves on the bodies of the dead or turn on each other and that kind of thing, that you'd start to see this sort of like fracturing element of that kind of alliance, which I think is quite interesting. And I think that the miniatures line has also sort of developed and changed over the last couple of years as well. This was one of the things that I really, really liked about, and I'm going back to Ushoran again for the second thing here. There's a really nice little story in here with Lord Kulshir, who is a vampire who is visiting the court of Ushoran. And when he comes there, he's got this little sort of amulet around his neck that has been given to him by someone he shouldn't have had given it to him by. And it sort of protects him from the delusions that spill forth from Ushoran. But Ushoran, in his kind of noble vampiric nature, has kind of noticed this, and there's some little sort of tweaks and things at the end which are like nudge nudge, wink wink. I know what's really going on, blah blah blah. You might think I'm some kind of mad crazy king who's gorging himself on flesh, but in actual fact I have a bit more of a handle on what's happening within the world, and I'm not to be underestimated. It helps that the Ushoran model is just gorgeous. An absolutely beautiful model that they added into the Flesh Eater Courts range towards the end of last edition. And I think the same thing goes for pretty much all of the stuff that you see as part of the Flesh Eater Courts book. A lot of their new models, especially their characters, look really interesting. I love what they've done with them aesthetically. They've managed to keep a lot of that kind of ghoulish vibe that people will know from Mordheim and Warhammer Fantasy Battles and the Old World and things like that. But they're kind of built on that in different ways. And especially when you see the newer stuff like the Morpeg Knights or the Crypt Guard, you get a really interesting idea of sort of how you could take that faction with the sort of new techniques for sculpting and things that they've developed. You can obviously see the age in some of the older stuff, like the Crypt Ghouls and the Crypt Horrors and things like that. But when you get to see the new stuff, I think it looks absolutely fantastic. And that's one of the things that's really nice about this army as a whole, is I think they've done a very nice job of updating it and bringing it in line with what they want Warhammer Age of Sigmar to be. This also then feeds into the narrative of the armies. Now, of course, I'm not here to tell you if anything is the meta or anything like that. I don't deal with that kind of thing. If you want to go and learn about that, there's plenty of videos for that on the internet. But I really like the cool thing that that element of delusion has been sort of brought forth into the base rules for the Flesh Eater Courts. And so you get a lot of that stuff in here that kind of is named and then linked into the idea of them being these noble warriors who actually are a bit weird. So you have a kingdom deluded, where you get the delusions, you've got a splendid pageant and a glorious banquet, but then within that you've got a whole bunch of different powers and things like that, battle traits and battle formations that you can use to kind of theme your army in different ways. I think it doesn't go far enough. I would say that's the case with pretty much all of the Age of Sigmar armies that we're seeing here, apart from the Blades of Khorne, which I think did a really nice job of theming the book. Everything else that's come out is kind of just a little bit off. It just needs a little bit more flavour. It needs a little bit of salt and pepper. And I think all of these armies would be absolutely fantastic. But it's a step in the right direction, especially for those people who like the idea of theme and want to explore a bit more of the characters and the factions and how they are different from what you'd see in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. You, of course, have all of your rules. Nagash is in all of the undead books, the death books. You have Ushoran there himself. The Aberrant Ghoul King and the Royal Terrorgeist is back. The Zombie Dragon has found his way into this army, as opposed to the Revenant Draconith, which is now in the Soulblight Gravelords set. But there's some really fun bits and pieces in here for people who actually want a little bit of theme and a little bit of sort of tweaking the fun out of different scenarios on the tabletop. Like, for example, one of my favourites is Grand Justice Gourmain. With his Gore Street gavel, he's essentially the judge of the Flesh Eater courts. He has arrest those miscreants in your charge phase. Pick a visible enemy unit within 8 inches of this unit to be the target. Roll a dice on a 3+ until the start of your next turn. The target has strike last what's in combat with any friendly Flesh Eater courts heroes and any friendly serfs or knights. And then he also has accusations of regicide. While you believe this delusion, add 1 to the damage characteristics of melee weapons used by friendly serfs and knights units while they are wholly within 12 of any friendly Flesh Eater Courts heroes that had any damage points allocated to them in the same turn. So I love that you've got even more of those delusions sort of like peppered throughout here. It's like you've got Sir Felgrin is abroad, who's got one there, another delusion, whilst you believe this delusion, blah, blah, blah. So there's lots of stuff in there which is really interesting for kind of, again, theming your army in different ways and building up an interesting force on the tabletop. They'll also paint stupidly quickly, which is always nice when it comes to something for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, even though I actually think the game is fairly balanced in terms of models to points costs. They do have a new Spearhead army, and this was where I had to give a golf clap to the Battletome writers. So one of the things, obviously, about the Flesh Eater Courts we've discussed already is that they are under these delusions, and they like the idea of being these kind of warrior knights and things like that with squires and everything. That has been baked into this, which I think is amazing. So I love when you dive right into this. Instead of just saying, undercoat them, they put, "Cometh the hour to prepare thy warriors for combat. Anoint them first with an undercoat of wraithbone." Didn't need to do that, but it's great. "Now take thy blessed pot of iron-rack skin, and with it base coat the flesh of thy serfs and vampiric nobles." That is just a random fun little thing that they've put into this book that they didn't need to do, but it really makes a difference in getting someone excited to kind of match up with the theme of what this army is all about, which I think is nice. So yeah, new Flesh Eater Courts Spearhead for you to have a pop at there, which I think is really fun. And of course you have your Path to Glory, which is always nice to see, with the Path of Royalty and the Path of the Subjects in there, which is good. You do have 2 Armies of Renown as well, so you have the Equinox Feast and the Knights of New Summer Court. So this one involves Ushoran and his knights, and then you've also got the Equinox Feast, which is all about High Falcon of Felgrin, and a whole bunch of different monsters and things that have been sent out to do the hunting. I also particularly liked this one Regiment of Renown, the Scarlet Jury. So this is where you could bring Grand Justice Gourmain, and you know how I was saying before, how they have got this really nice thing where they could actually line up with a lot of the Order factions. This allows you to do that with lots of different forces, as you can see there. And you have Grand Justice Gourmain in there, 1 Royal Decapitator and 10 Crypt Guard. So essentially, he denotes who needs to die, he cuts their head off, and they make sure they get to the gallows. And then you have Punishment Fits the Crime. For Gourmain, the practice of law is quite simple. The crime is always life, the sentence is always death. You believe the accusations of regicide delusion. There we go, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So that's sort of built into there as well, which is a great little addition for everybody as well. And then, of course, your rules reference at the back, which explains how the delusions work. Fantastic. So yes, lots of interesting things when it comes to the Flesh Eater Courts. I think they've done a really nice job of theming them, and the Battletome is a very fun read. It's really good for those people who want to get a handle on their lore and their background and how they've been folded into the events of the last little while. I will say, this bit of the story in the end of 3rd edition was absolutely amazing, where one of the Dawnbringer Crusades found itself within his Ushoran's domain, and so it was this really interesting mix between what was happening with Neferata and her agents, the coming of the Dawnbringer Crusade, who didn't really want to be there but found themselves sort of sitting around this banquet table with a whole bunch of ghouls and weird stuff, and then everything sort of exploded and blew up, and people got shot and all sorts of different things. So it was a really nice kind of like fun Warhammer of old style story, which is always nice to see. So yes, Flesh Eater Court, a fun new battle tome for them for this edition of the game. Really worth diving into and have a look at, especially if you're interested in doing something a little bit silly, but also incredibly easy and fun to paint up that army at the same time. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you like the theme of the Flesh Eater Courts? Do you think they should go even further with the way that they do that mechanically in the game as well? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. But most importantly, dive down to the comments and tell me what you think, because I always love having a conversation with you. I will be back in another video very, very soon, but that's me signing off. Bye for now.